Benjamin Franklin remarked that lead had been used for far too long, considering its known toxicity. You will observe with concern how long a useful truth may be known and exist before it is generally received and practiced on.
Hi there, and welcome back to part two of this series. In these next two videos, I want to focus on the two ingredients, the primary ingredients of the meta crisis, namely collective action failures and our relationship with technology. And so this one is on collective action failures. The clip at the start was from Veritasium's video on lead and Freon and Thomas Midgley Jr., who invented both of them, and I'll be using it again later. I include it because both lead and freon are excellent examples of collective action failures, where taking action to solve one problem creates far worse problems elsewhere. And this is a very common theme. And so here are just a few examples of what I mean by collective action failures. I mean, war by definition is a collective action failure, right? Where you're certainly not acting together, couldn't be more at odds with each other. There's a long list of man-made disasters. There's a few from the past there in blue. There's a few potential ones for the future there in red. Climate change, don't need to tell you how useless we are at coordinating over climate change. So yeah, I mean, I just want to read through a list which is on the screen for you. But the point with all of these is that our attempts to solve one small problem in one place creates far bigger problems in other places or everywhere. But in terms of the third attractor, this is a dynamic that we need to figure out a way out of. So it is the contention of Daniel that all of these collective action failures, all of these examples are driven by some common underlying drivers, and in particular, these three here. The first one is this idea of defining a problem too narrowly. I mean, Daniel gives an example from the videos of elephant poaching in Africa, right? So a game reserve wants to stop elephant poaching, and so they put up bigger fences and employ more wardens and get stiffer penalties for people that do the poaching. But in focusing only on poaching in elephants in this game reserve and failing to address the underlying causes of why poaching happens, right? The demand for ivory in the rich parts of the world, the poverty of the poachers that drive their need for income from it, the fact that a live elephant in a game reserve is worth zero on anyone's balance sheet, whereas a dead one with its tusks ripped out has a value on someone's balance sheet, right? None of these issues were addressed. And so all that actually happened was that more elephants were poached from other game reserves, more rhinos were poached, more gorillas were poached, and so it didn't actually solve the problem, right? It solved this little tiny, yeah, sure, fewer elephants were poached in this particular game reserve, so it solved that problem. But what it actually did was just transfer the problem and create bigger problems in the adjacent. The second thing is perverse incentives, and I'm just going to play another quick clip from that Veritasium video just to give you an idea of what perverse incentives can do to people.
Ethel Corporation had to build a new chemical plant in New Jersey, but the project began terribly. Within 2 months of operating, dozens of workers fell ill with lead poisoning. 5 of them died. To address the public outcry, Midgley held a press conference, and there he poured tetraethyl lead onto his hands, and he inhaled it for a full minute. He claimed he could do this daily without harm. But Midgley knew the dangers. The reason he had turned down the public talks was because he spent much of 1923 in Florida, where he himself was recovering from lead poisoning. He didn't go anywhere near his company's product if he could help it.
And so what we mean by perverse incentives, what Daniel means by perverse incentives is acting against your own self-interest, acting against the self-interest of your family, your friends, your community, acting against the interests of the whole in order to further some short-term or self-centered or narrow goal in the present. The people involved in the production and putting this out to the public knew for certain that they were going to cause harm. They may not have known the magnitude, they may not have known the exact nature of the harm, but they knew for certain that they were going to cause harm, and yet the incentive structure was such that they felt compelled to go ahead and do it anyway. And then the third thing is the multipolar trap. Multipolar traps are absolutely everywhere. Multipolar traps is, well, if I don't do it, somebody else will, so I might as well. An arms race is a multipolar trap. If they're developing weapons, then we have to develop nuclear weapons. If they're developing better nuclear weapons, then we have to develop even better nuclear weapons. And so these three things underlie pretty much all of the collective action failures that we witnessed. Just to have a very quick look at some of the costs of having used lead, just to give some sense of this idea of the costs outweighing the benefits, right? Like costs being externalized to the whole in order to benefit some short-term narrow goal. So the short-term narrow goal was obviously the profits of the companies and the alleviating of knocking in cars and the extra fuel economy and extra engine life that ensued. But what were the costs? So there's two graphs here. The one on the top is showing difference in IQ between people with high level of lead and low level of lead. This particular study shows a 5 to 10 point difference in IQ between people exposed to high and low levels of lead. And so multiply that by however many millions of people, and this is the collective loss to IQ, hundreds of millions, billions of points. The bottom graph shows the correlation between violent crime rates and lead in the atmosphere. And you can see there's a very striking correlation, and that's US data, but the same correlation is true all over the industrialized world. And other studies have confirmed this, right, that exposure to lead increases violent and aggressive behavior by a factor of somewhere between 2 and 5, something like that. It's not an exact science measuring these things, but the grand point is that as a consequence of all of this lead exposure, people as a collective, right, humanity as a global collective has been significantly more stupid, significantly more aggressive, significantly more violent than we otherwise would have been. And so the point is, how has history unfolded differently? What costs have been incurred as a consequence of our increased stupidity and tendency to violence from exposure to lead? So this idea of narrow focus, short-term gain for long-term loss, right? This is right at the heart of collector action failure, and this is what the third attractor has to figure out a way to avoid. So just to finish off a few thoughts, those three underlying drivers of defining problems too narrowly, perverse incentives, and multipolar traps, this manifests as a whole bunch of stuff. There's a few of them that I've listed here. Already talked about externalization of costs to the commons, right? That the cost of doing a particular thing, the negative impact of doing a particular thing, are not borne by the people that come up with it, right? They are borne by everybody else. All of these things are linked together. You can see very easily how ignoring and suppressing warning voices is linked to this willingness to externalize costs to the commons, right? People are going, hang on a minute, you can't do that. Shut them up because we're making money by doing that. In order to let people externalize costs to the commons, right? In order to allow them to continue to do that, it is great if you can capture the regulators that would otherwise stop you from doing that. The pollution of the information ecology over on the left-hand side, this is, sending out deliberately false information in order to further your own interests, or because you don't fully understand the problem, right? Defining the problem too narrowly can also be a consequence of that. You pollute the information ecology with misrepresentative, incomplete, misleading, or deliberately falsified information in order to achieve some other end than the truth. The grand effect of all of this is that our collective act, our attempts at collective action repeatedly either fail to solve the problem that they're supposed to solve, or do solve the problem but create worse problems elsewhere. And so the capacity of the whole to act collectively is diminished for the future, thereby making the likelihood of further collective action failures in the future more likely, right? It's like a vicious circle that feeds in on itself. So what are some of the lessons that we can take from all of this for the third attractor? Well, the first one, which I've mentioned several times already, is this notion of wholeness and interdependency, right? That every part is in fact part of a larger whole, and so damaging the whole will have the inevitable consequence of damaging every part of that whole. Even though this particular part may benefit in the short term, in the long run, all parts are damaged if the whole is damaged, and decision making needs to be taken in the light of that, right? You need to zoom out as wide as we possibly can and see the picture as broadly as we possibly can. The other thing is our incentive structures, right? When people are incentivized sufficiently to act against their own long-term interests or their own family's interests or their own neighborhood's interests or their own friends' interests, whatever, if people are sufficiently incentivized to act against those interests, well, those incentive structures have to change. And so this is another part of the third attractor, is to figure out incentive structures that reflect the actual common values that we all have. And listen, coming up with common values is extremely difficult, but something like universal thriving, right? Like all of our actions are taken in service of an attempt to increase thriving across the board for all things, and not feather my own nest at the obvious cost of universal thriving. And then thirdly is the multipolar trap. If you're going to have an AI weapon, then I have to have an AI weapon, and I have to get the AI weapon before you get it, because first is everything. And so all concerns of safety get thrown out of the window in the race to be first. And this is driven by the multipolar trap. And you can't get underneath that unless you have transparency, unless you can be absolutely sure that they are not developing an AI weapon. Only then can you take the gas off yourself. And to do that without it being intrusive and authoritarian, that's another one of the keys to the third attractor. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you again very much for listening. The next one is going to be a little bit about our relationship with technology. Okay, until next time, bye.
Burning lead in combustion engines spread the toxic element across the planet, into the air, oceans, the snow at the South Pole, and even our bones. Japan was the first to ban leaded fuel in cars in 1986, but other countries soon followed suit. Algeria was the last to do so in 2021. The UN calculates that the elimination of lead from gas saves over 1 million lives per year and $2.45 trillion. But leaded gas is still used, by the way, in piston-driven airplane engines. That's now the largest source of lead emissions into the air in the US. You will observe with concern how long a useful truth may be known and exist before it is generally received and practiced on.